Hello, and welcome to our webinar on how to write a staff expense policy. My name is Giles Greensmith. I'm the Head of Operations for Access Workspace. I have been implementing expense solutions for well over 10 years now.
And I'm Richard Giles. I'm Sales Manager working on Access Workspace, and I've been working with expense systems for over 15 years now. The purpose of this webinar is to provide you with an insight on how to write a simple expense policy that will streamline your processes, encourage a reduction in spend, and provide you with best practice expense policies that are fair to everyone in your organisation.
We know that writing expense policies is hard. It's extremely difficult. You've got a number of people that you need to consider. There are the, first and foremost, there are the staff or employees or volunteers in your organization that you need to reimburse. Then there's the needs of the company that need to be taken into consideration. There's also the needs of the operation of the business, the approvers of your expenses. To create an expense policy that works for all these individuals and entities is not straightforward and easy. So we have pulled together a toolkit which will help you consider, create, and put together an expense policy that is not only effective, but will work and be adopted by your organization. Customers over the years have regularly come to us asking for our help and guidance. So what we've done is distill this into a very easy to consume toolkit that'll help you guys create your policy.
And I think the key learning that we want to get across is that the best practice that we've learned from looking around at the industries is that best practice often requires a real change in thinking. The approach that you take, the way you look at the whole tool, the whole template for your policies needs to be different to what was the type of template that we saw probably in the late 90s and the early 2000s. Policies as a whole are changing now, and during the next 10-15 minutes we'll try and encapsulate what those changes should mean for you as an organisation. Over the next 10 minutes we're just going to be covering 4 or 5 key areas that should really help you provide a policy to your employees that fits all the best practice that we've found across the organisations we've researched. What we'll cover is a quick look at your legal obligations and how you need to make your policies fit with HMRC requirements. We'll look at some of the industry research that we've done. In this particular webinar, we'll just touch on it, but again, back to what Giles just said, the Expense Policy Toolkit, there's a download that holds a lot more information. And I think absolutely key, and an area we'll really focus on, is what not to do in an expense policy, some of the really common pitfalls that we've seen. And finally, obviously to really help you, we've provided a simple template that you can download and use and mark up as if it's your own. So one of the key areas that we come across that we need to highlight right at the start is obviously anything you do around your policies must fit in with HMRC guidelines. To really reiterate the point with HMRC, they have a number of guidelines that are well written and well structured that can be found on their website. So if you need that type of information and you need to know that it's accurate, then that's the best place to go to. And that will cover everything around benefits in kind, around entertainment, around the way that you can reclaim VAT with things like hot and cold food at lunchtime. That's an area that really needs some focus and really needs some guidance. Taking that to a different angle as well, you need to make sure that once you understand where HMRC is going to impact expense reimbursement, that your employees understand clearly what they need to enter from an information point of view so that they are fulfilling HMRC's requirements. And more importantly, you need to make sure your employees are aware that the information they're being asked to fill in is actually being driven by HMRC. It's not something that you're doing as an organisation, it's actually something that you have to do as an organisation.
I can't agree more. Having an expense policy that's nice and clear and open and articulates why you can or can't do certain things is absolutely key. It ensures the employee understands what's happening, as well as ensuring that you as an organisation are meeting your obligations. As Richard pointed out, most of you listening to this will appreciate that there are some, key fundamentals in and around certain business benefits that could be treated as benefits in kind. There are some tax implications, but there are also some very tricky areas, especially around the VAT, that can be an absolute minefield to navigate. The HMR website is full of extremely useful, well written, easy to digest information, and we absolutely encourage that you digest all of this before you embark on an expense policy creation. Otherwise, you might find yourself going back and having to redo a lot of it.
So over the last 6 months, we've been looking and researching at examples of expense policies provided by our clients and across other industries. I think the most interesting thing that's come out of those policies is the typical business limits that we see. And those limits are usually around things like food or accommodation. They give us a very clear picture on the types of rules and the type of expenditure companies expect. So some of the typical ones you may see are monetary limits. Example that we've got on this slide is around food. Somewhere within a lot of policies, there's a simple limit around, in this case, £5, but the associated rules that companies put into that are very often around when people can claim for food, if it's breakfast, what time of day they have to start if they're going to be allowing breakfast to be claimed. So it's really important that those monetary limits are clear. They are limits that people will understand. They must follow HMRC's allowances. If they are outside of HMRC's allowances, you've got a potential issue that you're creating for your organisation. And be very clear on things like travel. Air travel is a good example, but it's the same with rail. Are you talking about first class or standard class? What is it that as an organisation you're trying to achieve from your policies around business travel? And then finally, be very clear on the types of limits you have around parking and what your expectations are on parking. So in the download toolkit, there is a whole section on what industry standards are, and it's very clear the type of examples, the type of levels and limits that you'll be able to apply.
It's important that the limits that you set for employees are fair. There's a wealth of information out there about what the typical rates might be. For example, the average rate for hotels in the UK outside of London is about £90. The average rate for a hotel in London and some of the other busy places like Aberdeen, for example, is closer to £150. These limits change. The average a few years ago was significantly less. It's important that you review and adjust your rates on a typically annual basis at least. Our research and in my experience, it's definitely better to generally offer limits that are slightly higher than the industry average. This gets your users and your staff feeling that they're not being hard done by, and many of them will often book hotels or other expenditure far lower than the limit set. The final point is that you should be very clear in your expense policies as to whether the limits that you are setting are based on the net figure or the gross figure, because these can have significant implications on you as a business.
So again, in our research, some of the things that we found are very standard in the way people approach policies, but actually don't encourage adoption of policies or your whole expense process. So really common mistakes to avoid. The most simple one is around negative phrases. Some phrases we come across all the time are, you are not permitted to, or you must not. Focus instead on what they're entitled to do. Change your terminology so that you're actually reimbursing the majority who will reclaim expenses fairly, rather than focus your policy on fear of those who will abuse the system. You get better engagement, and actually you'll find your staff will start to try and underspend more if they feel that they've been bought into the way the policy has been written.
Being nice and clear and avoiding ambiguity is obvious. And for that reason, you should always get your policies reread to ensure that they are clear. One of my big bugbears is the date limit concept. Many organizations we come across will set a 3 or 6 month limit within which you have to submit your claims. On the surface, this sounds perfectly reasonable. And yes, HMRC does encourage you to keep your expense records up to date. But by setting hard date limits and having the system control that, you end up in a situation where the reality is that the end user, the employee, has in fact spent this money. They are out of pocket and they will seek reimbursement, albeit late. The result is that they'll simply falsify the dates or feel extremely aggravated or aggrieved by the situation. A far better way of dealing with individuals who are submitting expenses late habitually is to do it by reporting. Have a look at a list of individuals who haven't perhaps submitted an expense in a while and approach them and encourage them to start abiding by the policy, but avoid setting the sort of hard date concept.
I totally agree with that, Giles, and actually you can extend that whole principle to what we see very often, which is a policy around total expense limits. The total expense limits policy is one that actually people will always find a way of getting around in terms of putting it through on 2 claims. And actually what it does is it masks overspending and it really reduces control. Far more effective, in line with the date solution that Giles just suggested, is around reporting based on exception. Have a look at those people who are spending a lot of money, and not by individual claim, but over time. You can then actually go and, on a one-to-one basis, understand why they have a need to expense at such a rate.
I can't agree more. This is one of the key things that we've seen a lot of policies where they just don't quite get it right. You should always implement an expense policy or a system that will allow you to reject individual lines, individual items that have been overspent, rather than rejecting an entire claim out of hand. You're far better off rejecting one row or putting a single item under query and allowing the rest of the claim to go through for payment than dealing with that small amount separately. Otherwise, again, you end up with disgruntled employees or people who are willfully working around the system.
So having taken all of that information and looked through the best practices that we've seen, we've pulled all that knowledge together to help you write a successful policy of your own. The key thing to do within this, as far as we're concerned, is make sure that you really put your employees first. The more reasonable and fair you are, the more positive they become around incurring expenses and the way that they can get them reimbursed. And the more positive they become about the way they spend company money, because effectively, when you're reimbursing the expense, it is a company expenditure. Don't discourage them, enable them, but communicate cleanly with them. Put them first, manage their expectations so they can see that they're being trusted, that you're actually working with them rather than dictating down to them.
That is an absolutely fantastic piece of advice. If you want to write an effective expense policy that will be adopted and will be seen by the users as a benefit, you should put yourselves in their position. Write an expense policy for the employee rather than for the business. If you consider for a moment that you are asking your staff to put their hand in their pocket and spend their money on business expenses, it only feels right that the organization does whatever they can to reimburse those expenses as quickly and as fairly as possible. If you put a policy if your policy is based on a principle like that, you'll find that the users will subscribe to the policy, will adopt the policy, will work within the policy, and therefore, by extension, the organization and the other stakeholders will reap all the benefits.
One of the key things that we've found has really helped is, in particular helps actually the finance team, is creating simple things like an expense FAQ. If you put examples into those FAQs, if you put different scenarios into those FAQs, it stops the need for the users to come back to a centralized team to clarify on an ongoing basis. And our experience with our customers is it's that central team who can be inundated with questions that actually are standard answers that can be answered in the same way month in, month out.
The other thing that we found works exceptionally well is to pay your employees through the purchase ledger rather than the payroll. It often feels like the right thing to do is to push the payments through the payroll. However, as we all know, payroll pay times can be very constrictive. They're very set. Whereas if you pay your staff through the purchase ledger, you can introduce more frequent pay cycles. You can also, it'd be far easier as an organization to make ad hoc payments where necessary. It means that the payments to the users are not reliant on payroll cycles, which in turn mean that your employees will tend to submit the expenses more regularly.
So what we've done is taken all of that, the best practice advice, and we've amalgamated that into a Word document, which we provide through the toolkit as an expense policy template. It's a template that's ideal for you to be able to download, amend and update with any company specific information that you think is relevant, and just tweak it so that it's something that you can then adopt and use across your organization.
You can find the template at theaccess.group.com/expense-policy-toolkit. In addition to the expense policy template, there is a host of additional resources which you are free to use. In there are the various best practice ideas. There's some bits and pieces on the legal areas, and these items will help you create an expense policy for your organization that just works.
Now, to help you with applying your best practice expense policies, we obviously have a SaaS-based solution in Access Expense that has been built with over 15 years worth of experience to create an expense tool that will give your users a fantastic experience, being able to submit claims whilst using a mobile app, give your authorizers a very simple interface to ensure that your policies and everything that you've pulled together in your document is fulfilled, and then provide your finance team with something that is very easy to utilize to aid in their tax compliance and to report so that you can easily see how money is being spent and where it's being spent across your organization. All in all, a tool that will reinforce your policy that you've adopted within your organization.
And a solution that is, first and foremost, easy to use. So if you like what you've heard, please do get in touch. You can request a demo of Access Expense at theaccessgroup.com/expense, or if you prefer, drop us an email or give us a call. The address and the phone number are on your screen. Thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you very much from myself as well, and any feedback on any policies that you create would be greatly appreciated.